welcome to Post-Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and I'm back again today for another installment of my conversation with you about the pedagogy of the oppressed. And as I've already mentioned previously, the whole project here is to actually read the book and talk about it. So that's why the progress is so slow. And I apologize for that, but I think it's a book that we need to read carefully and then talk about. So today I will start where we had left in my last lecture, and that means we are still on page 57. And in these pages, Freire is trying to theorize and talk about the nature of the revolution itself, right? How do the oppressed first liberate themselves, but in the process liberate those who had previously oppressed them? But how do they make sure that their ascendance, the ascendance of the oppressed in itself, does not create a dichotomous relationship between them becoming the oppressors and the former oppressors becoming the oppressed? That's the question that he's trying to handle in these pages. And as always, I will first read and then briefly talk about it. I'll pause here also to encourage you to please subscribe to the channel so that you get occasional information from us whenever something new is posted. And also, if you have some time, do visit our new e-learning website. There is a video explaining it on my channel, but see if there is something that you like there and that you can register for and support us. The website is masoodraja.com. It's called Cross-Cultural Learning. Thank you so much. So I will now go to read the next passage, and I'll slightly touch upon the passage that we had discussed in the previous lecture. So what he was talking about is that what he's saying is it might seem simplistic that there is going to be a negative response from the formerly oppressor class whenever the oppressed change the system, right? And it is understandable. And he says beyond that, on page 57, he says, however, the moment the new regime hardens into a dominating bureaucracy, the humanist dimension of the struggle is lost, and it is no longer possible to speak of liberation. Now, there is a footnote here where he's going to explain what he means by bureaucracy, and I will read it. The footnote says, this rigidity should not be identified with the restraints that must be imposed on the former oppressors, so they cannot restore the oppressive order. Rather, it refers to the revolution which becomes stagnant and turns against the people using the old repressive bureaucratic state apparatuses, right, which should have been drastically suppressed, as Marx so often emphasized. So the fear of that counter-revolution, right, where the revolution is led by the masses, led by the people, but is appropriated by a power system which becomes equally as oppressive and destructive. Look at the French Revolution, look at the Iranian Revolution. These were all the revolutions appropriated by a dominant class, and they themselves, Russian Revolution, the same thing. So I continue reading. Hence, our insistence that the authentic solution of the oppressor-oppressed contradiction does not lie in a mere reversal of position, in moving from one pole to the other, right? That we can't just make the oppressed the oppressors and everything would be good. Nor does it lie in the replacement of the former oppressors with new ones who continue to subjugate the oppressed, all in the name of their liberation. So first of all, it does not, the solution to changing the oppressor-oppressed dynamic does not lie in a solution where the oppressed now become the dominant group and start oppressing their former oppressors. Nor does it lie in a third group coming in riding the wave of popular resistance and then speaking in the name of the people and becoming another dominant oppressive group, right? Both these scenarios do not, in his words, they are not truly authentic and humanistic, right? And we have talked about his romantic notion of the authentic and being human. And I read again, but even when the contradiction is resolved authentically, and the contradiction is the oppressor-oppressed contradiction, by a new situation established by the liberated laborers, the former oppressors do not feel liberated. And this is crucial. The regime that was in power, that has been overthrown, they are not going to feel liberated because the workers have somehow ousted them, right, supplanted them. On the contrary, they genuinely consider themselves to be oppressed, conditioned by the experience of oppressing others, right? Any situation other than their former seems to them like oppression. And this is crucial. Whenever a revolutionary class or a popular class replaces the privileged regime, whatever changes they might bring, right, if they are geared towards enabling more and more people to become fully human, or an equitable system, the regime that has lost its power, its people, its members, will see those instances as their own oppression. And why? Because they are only used to living within that privileged location, the rights that they had, the things that they had arrogated to themselves, whatever they could get away with, the privileges that they had. Now, if those privileges are no longer available or made available to more people, right, then to them, then it comes across as if the revolutionary group, the laborers, are taking away from them and giving it to the other. Because in their consciousness, the formerly oppressed have not yet realized that the system that they lived on was itself unjust and oppressive, right? So how does, for here is a great example of it. Conditioned by the experience of opposing others, any situation other than their former seems to them like oppression. This is the former oppressors. Formerly, they could eat, dress, wear shoes, be educated, travel, and hear Beethoven. While millions did not eat, had no clothes or shoes, neither studied nor traveled, much less listened to Beethoven. Any restriction on this way of life in the name of the rights of the community appears to the former oppressors as a profound violation of their individual rights. Although they had no respect for the millions who suffered and died of hunger, pain, sorrow, and despair. For the oppressors, human beings refers only to themselves. Other people are things, right? So this is the crucial thing. If a revolutionary movement, replaces the formerly oppressed class, what the formerly oppressor class, what they don't realize is what underwrites their privilege, right? Because they have internalized it. They have somehow assumed that they, have the right to all those privileges and the world owes them to them. They never stop to think that their privilege was underwritten, right, by the suffering of millions of people. And this is not so far removed from reality. This is not theory per se. Think of the world around us, right? There's a famous analogy that one of the authors uses, forgetting his name, who says that the world is like a dog, right, with a fluffy tail. The dog is starving, right? And it's most of the world. The fluffy tail is the richer parts of the world, the North Atlantic regions and all, right? And the problem is that the tail thinks that it can still survive even if the dog is sick and dying, right? Now, these people who have this privileged location in the world, a privileged lifestyle, they think that they have earned it. And if you even ever talk to them that, hey, let's take some away from you so that we can make the world equitable, you know, they would actually feel like they're losing what is inherently theirs, right? That's the feeling that he's talking about here, you know, of the formerly oppressed class. And I will keep reading. And part of the reason they can think like that is the thingification of the others, right? That at a certain level, the oppressor class always imagines that their humanity is somehow more superior, right? And all the other people can be instrumentalized to their purpose, or maybe their lives are not that important, right? And they internalize that logic. For the oppressors, there exists only one right, their right to live in peace, over against the right not always even recognized, but simply conceded, of the oppressed to survival. And they make this concession only because the existence of the oppressed is necessary to their own existence, right? So the oppressor class, or if we call it the oppressor consciousness or mentality, internalize that they have the right to resources, whatever, maybe they think they have earned it, right? And they do not concede or accord the same rights to the oppressed class. They just give them the right to survival, right? Living on scraps. I mean, think of the world around us, right? No one talks about making an equitable and just world. Even if you look at all the neoliberal economists and their political mouthpieces, what do they promise us in the end, right? That, all right, we will bring you jobs, but those jobs are not going to change your life, but you'll be able to make a living, right? While the same people are not concerned with making a living, right? Their actions support torturous regimes, their actions, financial decisions enable people to oppress people everywhere in the world, right? So the only thing that is offered to the oppressed, to the precariat, right, to part-time workers, to the daily laborers, is a promise of survival within the given system. Nothing more than that. And that's the logic that the oppressor group has internalized. And that's what comes to crisis, will come to crisis when the workers, when the formerly oppressed rise up and try to change the system. Now I continue reading. This behavior, this way of understanding the world and people, which necessarily makes the oppressors resist the installation of a new regime, is explained by their experience as a dominant class. Right? I mean, partially, since they have internalized the logic of their own position within a given economy or polity or culture, right, their resistance then comes from that. It stems from that because they genuinely believe that they are the one who should own the mode of production and have everything as it used to be, right? Once a situation of violence and oppression has been established, it engenders an entire way of life and behavior for those caught up in it, oppressor and oppressed alike, right? Think of it. Any system of oppression, any system that has a regime, it then forces people, right, to live according to whatever station is granted to them in that life, right? So if you are from the oppressor class, you will then assume certain powerful positions, you will have certain resources, there are certain things that you can do, and within that system the oppressed already have an assigned role. They can be servants, they can be farmers, they can be slaves, they can be peasants, right? And it is that precarious balance on which that system exists. Most of the times it is kept in place through oppression, right, through force. But if you have read your Antonio Gramsci and Althusser, you also know that it is also done through hegemonic means, right, by either creating an illusion of the willing consent of the people, right? But that system stays intact, right? And it creates both these subjectivities of the oppressor and the oppressed. And I read on. Both are submerged in this situation, and both bear the marks of oppression. An analysis of existential situations of oppression reveals that their inception lay in an act of violence, initiated by those with power. This violence, as a process, is perpetuated from generation to generation of oppressors who become its heirs and are shaped by its climate. This climate creates in the oppressor a strongly possessive consciousness, possesses of the world and of men and women. Think of it. Look at the slavery in the South. Now, these are well-meaning Christian people. So they had commodified human bodies, bonded them in slavery. They traded them in the market. But the system was so deeply entrenched that they could not imagine a life without owning slaves because their economy depended on it. So it created a subjectivity called the slave. What did it generate then? A whole system of trade, right? People capturing the slaves in West Africa, people transporting them for profit, right, to the Caribbean and from then to United States. People selling the slaves in the slave market. This entire dehumanizing system, who initiated it? The Africans didn't come to, the southern plantation owners and say, we would like to be slaves. No, it was deeply initiated through the violence of a group of people who had the power and resources to declare that using other human beings as their property, as slaves, and trading them as property is okay. It can be justified in Christian theology, whatever, right? That's what he's talking about. And that mentality, that consciousness is generational, right? It can be passed on to the next generation that is lived in the same privilege. So when the upheaval comes, what were they fighting for in the South? Yeah, okay, it was states' rights and all. We have different euphemisms for that. But to protect the right to own people, because their economy depended on it. They couldn't see, right, their fellow human beings, the African slaves, as equal human beings. And then the latent racism that still exists, the obvious racism, it relies on that historical recovery of that memory of once having been superior to the black people, right? That's where racism comes from, a fear, right, of looking at someone different from you and realizing that they are your equal, right? And the denial of that equality, right? That's what he's talking about. And this possessive consciousness is the consciousness which the oppressing class would then assume that they can own things, they can own people, that's their right, that's how things have been done, right? Apart from direct, concrete, material possession of the world and of people, the oppressor's consciousness could not understand itself, could not even exist, right? Because its understanding of itself is totally contingent upon people it can instrumentalize, people it can own, places it can own, things that, you detach it from that ownership, that possessiveness, there will be a vacuum, right? What are these people going to live for, right? What are they going to do, right? And that denial of what they formerly owned to them is kind of a denial of their extended identity, right? Because it depends on that. It depends on that inequality, hence the resistance to change, right? Fromm, Eric said of his consciousness that without such possession, it would lose contact with the world. The oppressor consciousness tends to transform everything surrounding it into object of its domination. The earth, property, production, the creation of people themselves, time, everything is reduced to the status of objects at its disposal, right? This is another way of saying is that, and that quote from Fromm comes from Eric Fromm's The Heart of Man. It's a 1966 book, and there's a footnote there. So the logic of the oppressor possessive consciousness is that they think that they have the right to instrumentalize people, instrumentalize nature to their purpose, right? And so resistance to change then comes from this consciousness, not simply because they are losing what they owned, but because without that ownership that defines their identity, their social identity, there's a vacuum. What are they going to be if they can't have slaves? Who's going to do like everyday chores? Who's going to work in the fields? Who's going to take care of their children? There's an entire dependency system that relies on the labor of the poor, on exploitation of the poor. I mean, think of it. In America, that's the argument people give. Every time someone says we should have a livable daily wage, hourly wage, the business leaders, right, they come, oh, we will go bankrupt. It will destroy businesses. That means it will destroy jobs, right? What is it that they are arguing for then? I mean, if you look at it carefully, their interest, their dependence is connected to labor being cheap. So if they can only be profitable when my and your labor can be cheapened, what kind of a business model is that? But that is what they always say. Oh, if we raise the minimum wage, businesses would fail, right? Which is an exact acknowledgement of the fact that the businesses need cheap labor to succeed. How do you keep labor cheap? Keep them precarious, give them less rights, don't let them unionize, don't even let them know that they are exploited, right? But the moment you shift that system, people who are dependent upon, consciously and materially, on exploitation of others, right? They are the ones whose social and individual identities come to crisis, right? Think of it, any culture, wherever there is a dominant group, right? Especially dependent on the labor of the poor, right? The undocumented, women. If you start an initiative to teach the women of their rights, to tell the undocumented how to get work, right? These people will immediately pillory you, because it's not just that you are trying to change the system, but you're hitting them exactly at the very place where their survival lies, where their identity lies, right? Because their identity is connected to exploiting others, right? I'll just read another paragraph. This is fun, right? And we are at page 58, by the way. In their unrestrained eagerness to possess, the oppressors develop the conviction that it is possible for them to transform everything into objects of their purchasing power. Hence, their strictly materialistic concept of existence. Money is the measure of all things, and profit the primary goal. For the oppressors, what is worthwhile is to have more, always more, even at the cost of the oppressed having less or having nothing. For them, to be is to have, and to be the class of the haves. I'm going to stop here. So, oppressive consciousness that he is talking about is a possessive consciousness, and it is driven through the logic of material gain. An oppressor group doesn't just want to have power. They also want to have power to extract more wealth, to constantly increase it. Their understanding of their privilege is materialistic. So the profit motive becomes a justifying principle. You only look at how profitable your company is, how profitable your business is. And if you're making more money and your business is more profitable, you can convince yourself that you're doing well and you're a successful human being. In the process, what will fall by the wayside is how you're treating the people. Who are you exploiting? How are you exploiting them? Because that is not what has a bearing upon your actions. It's the profitability of your venture, profitability of your business. And that defines your humanity. But it also makes you dependent on a system of exploitations. And your success always depends upon having more, possessing more, right? And that divides the world into haves and have-nots. And it's always at the cost of others. Think of it this way. My wife once worked for a company that specialized in making certain things, right? Which they sold. Totally useless things, but people bought them, right? And the guy who owned the company had moved his entire manufacturing to China. And when he would negotiate the price of an item, he will even negotiate that he would pay 5 cents less than what the workers were asking for. That's how deeply those who rely on profit motive, how deeply they would cut into whatever little is given to the workers, right? And that's a mentality everyone has. Like those who are in the dominant position, they always want to extract more work from the workers. They want submission. And they always want a bigger return on their investment. And then they internalize this idea of benevolent capitalism, where they can assume this idea that they are creating jobs, right? Not realizing that without the people who are producing the commodities, who work, who labor, capital, maybe the speculative capital will make some money by itself, but without the commodities, without the work of labor, where are they going to take that money, right? So that's the logic he's talking about. So in these 2 pages, from middle of 57 to 58, we are still, Freire is still on the dynamics of post-revolutionary interactions between the formerly oppressed and the oppressors. And he's giving us this instruction into understanding the oppressor consciousness, right? Its very connection to material possessiveness, its connection to exploitation of others, and that its internalization of this idea that simply because you're from a dominant group, you deserve better and you have the right to possess more things, and that it's okay in the process. So many people are exploited, right? Some people do it consciously, but most people internalize it unconsciously. If they are in a privileged position, they don't even acknowledge it, they don't even think about it. They just assume that these people around them are there to serve them, right? Think of it. Have you ever run into a person like that, a person who walks into a restaurant? It doesn't even have to be far-flung parts of the world where there are cultural hierarchies. Here in the United States, a person who looks at restaurant workers differently, treats them differently, thinks of them differently. A person who looks at part-time workers differently. And then if you bring in race and gender and sexuality, it gets further accentuated. All these people, are part of that constituency that has internalized that they deserve to be served because they are materially successful, they have more wealth, and that other people are there to serve them, right? And it's okay if they are poor. It's probably their own fault, right? There are so many different justifications that they use. So that's what he's talking about, the question of purchasing power, and that the dominant group has it, and those who are oppressed, they don't. And that's the dynamic that the oppressor group would like to keep in mind, because within the logic of power in which they exist, they have arrogated that right to themselves. So that's all I have today. I will be back with another lecture on the same chapter 1. We are still on chapter 1. Thank you so much for joining me. And as always, if you have any questions, please send them my way, and I'll be happy to answer them. And I'm grateful that you all respond to these lectures and appreciate them. As always, please do subscribe, and please do check our learning website. I would love to have your support there. Thank you so much. And with this, until the next time, Goodbye.